At ease. Thank you, Dan. I'm flooded with mixed emotions sitting down there listening to what's going on. I don't think I've ever had this kind of an audience before. And I've had a lot of audiences in my years crusading. But this group is absolutely different. It's different because basically you appear to be a politically oriented group. But you're not. You're based on principle. And that is unusual for me to see. I mean, I don't care whether it's Republican or Democrat. Most politically oriented groups are all about, winning the election. Winning the election. What do we do to win? That's all. Win what? Well, it doesn't make a difference. Just get our guy in. And I don't see any of that here, and I'm so impressed, and I'm humbled, and I'm honored that you think enough of my work and what I've done to invite me to speak before you tonight. I thank you for that. And I don't know what to say because, I'm kind of prepared to speak before a politically oriented group, and on that basis, I know from experience that you have to walk very gently on the eggshells. You don't have to get too controversial, otherwise you'll have people saying, well, that's going to interfere with the progress, And I don't know how to deal with that because if I can't speak controversial, I can't speak. That's all I am interested in dealing with are controversial items. And so I was invited here to speak about the Federal Reserve System, and I didn't want to do that. I wanted to speak about ideology. So I'm listening to the comments here earlier, and I don't know what to do, so I'm totally split down the middle. So I've decided that I'm going to do both, okay? Which is going to be a disaster, I'm sure, but no, I can do it. I know we don't have a lot of time, but may I ask for a show of hands of those of you who have read The Creature from Jekyll Island? Holy moly. Well, that's well over half. All right, what 40%? Okay, I'll give 40% of my time to, actually it should be the other way around, shouldn't it? Because if you already read the book, or you've heard one of these pirated DVDs or CDs, you already know what I'm supposed to say. So I can't see why I'm going to talk about the Federal Reserve. But yet, Dan says people want to hear about the Federal Reserve, and I know that that's true. So what I'm going to do is give a little brief summary of what I think I know about the Fed and what's important to you folks. And then I'm going to take that hat off and put on my ideology hat, and I'm going to talk to you about something called Idea X. So without any further wasting of time, let's jump right into it. How can you summarize something like the Federal Reserve System into a short summary? And it's not too easy. You just start with the basics. And you can usually condense the most complex ideas down to just a few words. And I could say, for instance, that the Federal Reserve System is a scam, and I'm through. I'm done. I've delivered my speech. Any questions, Well, that's not quite good enough for most people. Well, why is it a scam? Well, it's a scam because it pretends to be something that it is not. And it's pretending to be a government agency that was formed for the best interest of the American people. It's pretending to be an agency responsive to the will of the people that is dedicated to benefiting the society and the economy, to controlling inflation, to providing jobs, and to stabilize the currency, and do all these good things for the economy for the American people, but it is not. It doesn't do those things. It's not what it really is formed to do. So I'm here to tell you in as few words as possible that the Federal Reserve System is not a government agency, as many of you already know. It looks like one. It's carefully crafted to look like one. But in reality, it is nothing but a cartel. It's no different than no different than an oil cartel or a banana cartel. It just happens to be a banking cartel. And that means it is comprised of the big banks of the United States with strong influence from their partners around the world. And they decided back in 1910, when legislation was being talked about, to control banking, to bring banking under control to benefit the American people, because there was a lot of concern in those days among the people and congressmen that the Wall Street banks were out of control. And they knew that it was just too much power over the monetary system and interest rates and who got the best deals in business and the flow of money and all of that sort of thing. And so there was a pressure from the grassroots to draft some legislation that was going to regulate the banks for the benefit of the people for a change. So basically what happened is the banks themselves certainly knew that this was afoot, and they wisely decided that why should they sit around and wait for the Congress and their foes to draft legislation that really would control the banks? Why would they be silly enough to let that happen when they themselves could take the lead and draft their own legislation and make it appear as though it was something that was going to regulate the banks on behalf of the people? And that is exactly what happened. The Federal Reserve System was created under conditions of great secrecy on an island, Jekyll Island, off the coast of Georgia. And it was drafted by 6 people that were representatives of the big, powerful banking interests. You know, the Rockefellers, primarily the Rockefellers, and J.P. Morgan, those banking interests, they dominated the American economy. They and their representatives of Kuhn Loeb and Company, which touched bases across the seas. The people that went to Jekyll Island, there were only 6 of them, represented, and this was an account that was published in the New York papers back in 1910, they represented the wealth that they personally held or held through the institutions which they controlled. And I'm glad you're all sitting down for this one. Approximately 1/4 of the wealth of the entire world. Now, if that isn't a concentration of economic power, I don't know what you would call it. And these are the guys who were the big banking trust, you know, the money trust, as it was called in the newspapers at that time. People were concerned about breaking the grip of the money trust. This was the money trust. And so they went to Jekyll Island so they would be out of view. They traveled, you know, privately on this railroad train, this railroad car, privately owned by Senator Nelson Aldrich. And they traveled 2 nights and a day, and they went to Jekyll Island in Georgia. And for a whole week, they sat around a table there, and they drafted what became the Federal Reserve Act. What they really wrote, of course, was a cartel agreement. It was, when you read it with that eye, you understand that what they wrote was a cartel agreement, which meant they regulated themselves to make sure that competition between them would not get out of hand, so that they could control prices and they could divide up markets, and what all cartels always do. They created a shared monopoly, in other words. And then they took it to Washington, and mentally, you might imagine, they took this big eraser and they erased from the top of the page the heading that said cartel agreement. Didn't want that on it. And then they carefully wrote in Federal Reserve Act. Now it's the same document, same substance, and they gave it to Congress and they talked about how great it was going to be for the American people. And they passed it into law. And that means that you and I now have to obey the terms of a private cartel agreement, or we go to prison because it's law. And the fact that we go to prison if we disobey it makes it seem as though it's a government agency, because who else can send you to prison? And the answer is a cartel can do that if it can purchase Congress and get a law passed to do it. Congress can do anything it wants to do it. In this case, it handed its power, its authority to monitor and create and control the nation's money supply. They handed that to a private banking cartel. And that explains everything. Once you understand what happened on Jekyll Island back in 1910, and then the 3 years that followed as this plan evolved and finally was passed into law on 1913 in the Christmas session when everybody was going home, it was passed into law, and everybody thought it was a great American institution because at last we were going to control those big, bad banks. And just the opposite was the case. And once you understand that that was the history and that's what actually happened, then all the mystery of the news events of our modern day are cleared up. You wonder what is going on when they're bailing out the banks. Well, who is bailing out the banks? The banks are bailing out the banks. The Federal Reserve System is the banks. It's not a government agency. The Federal Reserve System is running the show. In other words, the banks are running the show. And the congressmen are like little puppets on strings, and they vote yeah or no. They don't care. It's not their money. It's all created out of nothing by the Federal Reserve. It's been the Federal Reserve Act, I should say, authorized the banks to create money out of nothing and put down the formulas that would be required by law to do it. So it's all unfolding exactly as it was planned back in 1910. And when you see Congress voting for $1 billion here and $1 billion there to send to the banks, all they're doing is really authorizing a formal authorization of the banks to do what they were going to do anyway, what they wanted to do, and that is to create money out of nothing and then lend it to the federal government and then give it to the banks or lend it to the banks or some shenanigan, they get it to the banks in some way. So it all goes to the banks. So we have a system of the banks, for the banks, and by the banks. And people say, what is going on? Because they really think that the Federal Reserve is a government agency. And it doesn't make sense that way. And of course it doesn't make sense because that's not the way it is. Once you understand that the Federal Reserve is a banking cartel, then everything is cleared up. Of course the banks are the only ones that come out of this economic mess in the black because it's all rigged for them. And the bill is always passed on to the taxpayer or the consumer because part of it is paid for by taxes, but the larger part of it is paid by inflation, the hidden tax called inflation. Because when banks are able to create billions and billions of dollars literally out of nothing and push it into the economy by going through the appearance of loaning it to the government or loaning it to corporations and that kind of thing, it inflates the money supply at a much faster rate than the quantity of goods and services is going into the society. So when the goods and services goes up at this rate and the money supply goes up at this rate, what happens? Well, the value of the purchasing power of the units and the money supply become less and less and less because they're always measured against the total supply of goods and services. So you and I and everybody else, we pay for all of this through inflation. And believe me, we haven't seen the inflation yet that was created because most of it so far was shipped overseas. Because the world still is using American dollars because as bad as American dollars are and as worthless as they are, they're stronger than any other currency, or most of them anyway. And so there are a lot of countries around the world, for whatever reason, and we won't go into here, but there are good reasons for countries to want to still use American dollars because their own currencies are even worse. By far worse. So they cannot conduct significant financial transactions in their own local currencies. They must use American dollars. And so we've been able to get these nations around the world, these poor people around the world, they're still hungry for our dollars because that's what they're using in their own currency, in their own countries. And so we've been able to, and there's this magic phrase, we've been able to export our inflation. That's what that means. We're exporting the inflationary effect is hitting the other parts of the world, but not us for now. But sooner or later, all that money that's out there, American dollars, especially when we come to the point where people recognize that the American dollar is going by the wayside also, and they no longer are wanting or able even to use American dollars in place of their currency. If our competitor nations around the world come up with other currencies that are more attractive than the American dollar, all of these forces are at work at present, then all of a sudden these dollars, these so-called euro dollars that are all over the world knee-deep, they'll come back to the United States because people in those countries will say, well, these American dollars are even becoming worthless now, so let's send them back to the United States quickly while we can still buy something in America. And they'll all start coming back, and they'll buy all of our products. It'll seem like a wonderful thing, but all of a sudden inflation goes rampant, and they'll buy everything we have. You know, we'll buy our automobiles, our real estate, our politicians, anything that's for sale, and we wind up, now we're this deep in American dollars, and you think about inflation, you think it's bad now. When all those euro dollars come back to the U.S., we won't be able to buy anything with them. That's the day of reckoning, and that's where all of this will end if we don't put an end to the system real soon. I like to say that America has to abolish the Federal Reserve System, or else, if we don't, the Federal Reserve System will abolish America. It's as simple as that, and it's a question of dollars, if not principles. Now, there's the whole thing, the Federal Reserve. I think any school child can understand that it's a scam. That's what I said. It's a scam. Any questions? It's a simple thing. But it's hard for the American people. It was hard for me to understand that this was just a plain old simple scam, because I had been brought up to think that our government was, in charge, and they were really concerned about me, and that they were protecting my interests, and this was too complicated for me to understand, and that nothing like this would be crooked because there are laws against crooked deals like this, aren't there? I believed all of that. But once you get that cleared out of your mind and you realize that banks are some of the most unscrupulous organizations in the world, once you recognize that that is a reality, then everything clears up. You understand what's going on in the world. Well, there's my short seminar on the Federal Reserve System. And so I guess I'm ready now to go to my favorite topic, which is Idea X. Why is the Federal Reserve System functioning? Now we're going to stop looking at what is happening and start asking why. And this is where I like to go, because I find that too many issues of the day are focused on what, who, where, when, how, but never why. And if we don't understand why we have these problems in the world, we're not going to solve them. And I'd like to suggest that the major cause of most of our social, economic, and political problems, certainly in America, and I think around the world, are the consequences of what I call Idea X. It's an ideology, it's a thought, it's a philosophy that has captured literally the whole world. It's relatively new in history. It's a little over 100 years old. That's nothing in the historical tableau. About 120, 150 years. It's an idea that is taught in our schools. It's an idea that is seldom challenged seriously in our political chambers. It's an idea which, at the leadership level at least, that both American political parties have adopted and never challenge. It's an idea that most candidates for office, regardless whether it's the national, local level or regional levels, they may compete against each other on who's the best man for the job or who will best represent their population, but they never disagree on this Idea X. They both agree on that. And everywhere you look in the world, you realize that, oh my gosh, here's an idea that has literally conquered the world in my lifetime, or at least I was here for half of it, and I never knew it until fairly recently, and I began to study and analyze. What is this idea? It has a name. The name was quite commonly used about 80 years ago or 90 years ago. I find it all the time in the old books, but not in the new ones. The name is collectivism. And there's an idea Y, I might say, that is the opposite of X, and that is individualism. And those words, too, were commonly found in the old books, but not in the new. These are strange words, especially to Americans, and I believe that it is absolutely essential that we restore these words to the language so that everyone clearly understands what they mean. Because once that has happened, we'll begin to see the common cause that lurks beneath most of the problems that we're trying to solve in the world today. And the connection between that and the Federal Reserve System is that the Federal Reserve System is a kind of a creature called a central bank, which is a method of funding collectivism. Collectivism cannot be funded in any other way except through this scam that we call the Federal Reserve System, or in other countries we just call them the central bank mechanism. It's a method of extracting money from people against their will through a process which they don't clearly understand and over which they have absolutely no control. And it's impossible in a free market economy. It's impossible in a political system that has honest money, money that is backed by something of intrinsic value. So the connection between the Federal Reserve and collectivism is very fundamental. The Federal Reserve is the mechanism by which collectivism is always funded. So what is this thing, collectivism? It took me quite a while to discover it, first of all. And I remember back in the early days of my learning on this, it was in the 1960s, I began to become curious about this thing called communism. And I discovered that there was a communist bookstore in Los Angeles called the People's Bookshop. So I started to hang out down there with the comrades. And I wanted to find out what this was all about. I didn't really know whether it was good or bad. I thought it was bad because everybody said it was bad, but I wanted to find out myself. So I went down to the People's Bookshop, and I really stuck out like a sore thumb. I'm in the insurance business. I got my suit and tie on, and a bunch of hippies down there, you know. But not the guys at the top. They were more savvy. They didn't look out of place. Anyway, so I found out what they believe. I think I read every book they had in the store, at least the major ones. And of course, you start with Karl Marx, you know, Das Kapital and you know, Communist Manifesto. And then you go to the works of Lenin, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. He's quite a prolific writer. And then you read their stuff from Stalin, and they have study groups on it. And I was really a serious student, and I began reading all this stuff, taking notes and collecting ideas and participating in these study groups. And they tried to recruit me, and I let them think I was interested, but I really wasn't, because I thought this didn't make sense at all, but I wanted to learn. And when I went through that phase, I started to read the works of other collectivists. And I got hold of Hitler's Mein Kampf. I thought, my gosh, I just read this in Lenin. I just read this in Marx. The same thing, except in, you know, a little different language, but the principles were the same. And then later I started to read the works of, you know, the communists in China, Mao Zedong. It's the same thing. And every place I looked, Mussolini, same thing. All of these communist, Nazi, socialist, fascist systems, once you peel off the label and look underneath, you find the same thing, the same principles. And I started to make notes as to the commonality between them. And I was able, in a very short period of time, to isolate, nine general factors which were common to them all. And I felt that 7 were really the most important ones. And I'd like to spend what amount of time we have left here just giving you an overview of what those 7 elements are that represent a clear-cut statement of philosophy, political philosophy, that differentiates between collectivism and individualism. And I'm here to tell you that whether you know it or not, you folks are dyed-in-the-wool individualists on every one of these, and you'll recognize that, although you may never have even thought about that word being in. All right. Now, let's start with number 1, the origin of human rights. Now, isn't this fundamental? Where do we get our human rights? Or do we have them at all? Is it just a fiction, or do we really have rights? Well, there are 2 views, basically, 2 views on this. Collectivists say, and they're very clear on this, that rights are granted by the state. You get your rights from the state. Read the United Nations documents. There's something called the Draft Covenant on Human Rights. It's lifted word for word out of the Soviet Constitution, by the way, which I have read. I read it, underlined it. Soviet Constitution is a wonderful document if you just read it casually. It grants all kinds of rights. Right to employment, right to freedom of speech. Did you know that the old Soviet Constitution guaranteed freedom of speech, freedom of religion? Yes. Nobody had it, but it was guaranteed. And, you know, how can they do that? Nobody had it, but it was guaranteed. Well, the same language was lifted from the Soviet Constitution and now is in virtually all of the collectivist constitutions of the world, and the most classic example is the UN Draft Covenant on Human Rights. Read those statements. Here's how it works. Here's the trick. I'll go directly to the UN Covenant because it's the same as the Soviet Constitution. It says, every man and woman and child has the right to employment. Okay, let's just take that. Or freedom of speech. Absolutely has the right to freedom of speech. Except, what? Except, and then read on, as may be provided for by law. You have a right to a job, peaceful assembly. You have a right to all kinds of things, religion, freedom of speech, except as may be provided for by law. That's written right there. If you read those documents with as much care as you would read a used car sales contract, you would never sign them. And yet they're given to our school kids, and they think, oh, that sounds wonderful. Right to this, and right to that, and right to that. And they never notice the little phrase that says, except as may be provided for by law, which simply means if they want to take these rights away from you, they just pass a law, and zoom, they're gone. And so you come to the amazing, simple realization that if the state has the right to grant you, the power to grant you your rights, it has the power to take them away from you. And that's exactly what it does. And that's the collectivist view. Now, the individualist view is no. Rights come with the individual. Some say they're God-given rights. Others would say, well, I don't know about that, but I know that when I was born, by golly, I think I had them when I should have had them, and that's what I want to believe. They come with the individual, one way or the other. It's hardware, not software. It's part of your program. It's part of your computer. You've got it. It's not added to you like software would be. And this is a very important point. And of course, you find it in all the founding documents of the American experiment, the American Constitution in particular, and in the Bill of Rights. As was stated earlier here from this platform, the Bill of Rights doesn't say you have this right unless provided for by law. It says Congress shall not pass any law on this, or this either. You better not even touch that one. It's not except as provided for law, but no law. What a difference that is, and how clear it is, and how many people understand that or even thought about it. It should be taught in school. So there's number one. All collectivist systems believe that the state is the source of all rights, whereas individualists believe that the human being is the proud possessor of rights, and you cannot take it away from him unless you violate his rights. The next one is which is supreme, the group or the individual? Now, this is very fundamental. This is where the rubber meets the road in most cases when you think about it. As the word suggests, collectivists believe that the group or the collective is more important than the individual, and that the individual must be sacrificed, if necessary, for the greater good of the greater number. Sound familiar? I was taught that in school. It sounded great to me. The greater good of the greater number, who can argue against that? Isn't that the basis of democracy? Well, there's that another word we have to redefine. Democracy, is it good or bad? Well, our founding fathers thought it was terrible, and they even said so. You won't find the word democracy in our founding documents. You find the word republic, but not the word democracy. I'd like just to remind you, you probably have heard these quotes, but in case there's anyone here or on the recording that hasn't heard these, what's the difference between a republic and a democracy? Well, let's talk about democracies. In the colonial America, I think the view was best expressed by Samuel Adams, who said, quote, democracy never lasts long. It soon wastes, exhausts, and murders itself. There was never a democracy that did not commit suicide, end quote. That's what our founding fathers thought, and they knew history. In England, it wasn't just in America, but in England, we've all heard about Lord Acton. You know, he's the guy that said, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts, absolutely. It's a nice quote because it rolls from the tongue. By the way, in researching this, I found that Lord Acton is also quoted with being the inventor of the flush toilet. I just thought I'd throw that in. I thought that was interesting. But we don't remember him for that. We remember him for some of his quotes. And here's one. He said, the one pervading evil of democracy is the tyranny of the party that succeeds by force or fraud in carrying elections. Bingo. That's it. And then in Scotland, there was a history professor who taught at the University of Edinburgh. His name was Alexander Tyler, and I thought he had the best summary of the whole thing. He said, quote, "A democracy is always temporary in nature. It simply cannot exist as a permanent form of government. A democracy will continue to exist up until the time that voters discover that they can vote themselves generous gifts from the public treasury. From that moment on, the majority always vote for the candidates who promise the most benefits from the public treasury, with the result that every democracy will finally collapse due to loose fiscal policy, usually followed by a dictatorship," end quote. And that is why the Founding Fathers were against a democracy. And so when we hear this phrase that, for the greater good of the greater number, we're kind of responding to this instinct that we have that, well, what's wrong with the greater good of the greater number? Isn't that the highest ideal? Well, it's not really when you think about it. Because think of a lynch mob, for example. Now, this is pure democracy in action. There's only one dissenting vote. So what's wrong with that? Well, wait a minute, that forces us back to the thinking pad again. Well, the thing that's wrong with that is that the group is not superior to the individual. The individual has rights that stand against the group, no matter how big the group it is. And it makes no difference how many people want that guy hung, depending on the system you live in and the culture you live in. In our culture, we say that every man, regardless, is entitled to a fair trial by a jury of his peers, and that you just can't take a show of hands and say how many want this guy dead and how many don't. So the difference then between a republic and a democracy is delicate, it's subtle, but it's extremely important. A democracy believes that the majority should rule, period, end of discussion. In a republic, the concept is that the majority should rule up to the point where it violates the rights of an individual, and that the individual is supreme against the majority when it comes to the individual rights. Now, this whole thing comes down to a sort of a mind game. I had trouble with it for the longest time because we get the idea that numbers count somehow, that somehow the rights of 10 people are greater than the rights of one people, and because they're a group, and it's a mathematical concept. I had trouble with that. But here's something to ponder. The group doesn't even exist. What is a group? Can you see a group? No. You can't see a group. You can only see people, individuals. It's like the word forest. Forest does not exist. Only trees exist, really. You can't touch a forest, but you can touch trees. You can't see a forest, but you can see trees. And this word group and the word forest, those words are mental abstractions. They're mathematical concepts. They're not real. They're the figments of the imagination. They're not real. And when we say that something that is not real, it's just an abstraction, has rights that are superior to something that is real, like an individual, we've made a terrible blunder, because that means that some tyrant can come along, some politician can come along with rhetoric about the people, and everybody's charged up, the group, and that tyrant says, I represent the people. I represent the party. I speak for the party. I speak for the group. And all of a sudden you're back to tyranny again, and the people are saying, yeah, it's okay. I guess it's okay because I voted and this is a democracy. That's the trick. The group doesn't really exist at all. And when you think that all the way through, you come to the amazing conclusion that the greater good for the greater number is accomplished only by preserving the rights of the individual. Once you do that, that is the greater good of the greater number. Thank you. Okay, I have to move along. I'd like to talk more about that, but we come finally to a third very important demarcation between individualists and collectivists. And that is that collectivists don't really believe in freedom. They talk about it, but they don't believe in it. They don't think that people can be trusted. that they're too damn dumb to know what is best for them. And if you give them freedom to act, they're going to make terrible mistakes. And so we who have been to school, we who are the philosopher kings, we who understand these things, we who are trained as the elite, we who know how to run things, we should make the decisions for them, and they better follow our will because it's for their own good. And we will force them to do that. And so collectivists believe in force. They believe that if something is good, people should be forced to do it. And individualists believe if something is good, well, they should be encouraged to do it, but not forced to do it. They should have freedom of choice to make mistakes. I think one of the best examples is the seatbelt law. Can you imagine anything more stupid than a seatbelt law? Collectivists say, well, you know, seatbelts are important. If you don't wear your seatbelt, you could have an accident, and you could be injured. You might even get killed. Seatbelts are very good. Therefore, let us pass a law. And by golly, if you don't wear your seatbelts, you dummy, we're going to put you in jail. I have a friend, a very close friend. He's got that mentality. You can always spot a collectivist. If he has disfavor with something, somebody throws a cigarette on the sidewalk, he says, there ought to be a law. That's his immediate reaction. There ought to be a law to make everybody do what is right. Individualists say, okay, seatbelts are a good idea. I have seatbelts. I wear seatbelts. And I think people should wear seatbelts. If they don't wear them, they're stupid. But I'm not going to force them under threat of law to do it. I may contribute to an educational campaign to convince them. I may, most of all, show by personal example that I wear my seatbelt, and by example, show other people how to do things, but I'm not going to put people in prison and use force against them. Very important distinction between these two groups of people. Move on. Number 4, very important. Property rights are human rights. Collectivists do not believe that humans have any right to property at all. They think that because it is limited in quantity, it's part of the commons, and we meet in a building that's called the Commons and so forth. It reminds me of that. But yeah, they believe that humans should not have property. All collectivist systems have that belief. Why? Because if humans are allowed by the state to have property, they tend to be independent. You take away a person's property, and they cannot survive without charity from some source. And what's that charity source going to be? The state. All collectivist systems want their people completely dependent on them, the state, for sustenance and for survival. They want to tell them where to live, what kind of food they can grow, everything about them, and they cannot do that if people are allowed to have personal property. And that is why all collectivist systems are opposed to private property, and why all individualists instinctively know that private property is a human right. And we don't have time to go into that, but there's a lot to be said in favor of that. It's an instinct. One of the best books I recommend that you read is called The Territorial Imperative. It's a beautiful book on biology and how all the species of the world have this, most all of them, have this instinct for property and possession of territory and so on. It's just built into us, and it's there for a good reason. You take that away from them, and the species just withers. It just doesn't know how to act. It even loses its mating instinct, believe it or not. And if you deny many species the right to their territory, they don't mate anymore. And it's part of us. It's a natural process. And when you think it through, you realize that only people who are allowed to own property are the ones who will take care of property. And so they're the only ones who are good stewards of property. And those who argue that we must have the state take care of all property so we can preserve the environment, and all that stuff, they're on the opposite side of logic, because only people who are responsible for their property take good care of it. The welfare renters do not take care of their apartment as well as those who are paying for their own property. It's as simple as that. Okay, move on. Number 5, we're back to the Federal Reserve. Money without coercion. I said a moment ago that the Federal Reserve was the funding mechanism for collectivism. If you gave people a choice of what money they would like to use, between, let's say, Federal Reserve notes and gold coins, what do you think most people would eventually wind up using? Duh. You know, as the value of those paper things keeps going down, 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 and yet the value of those shiny little things keeps holding its value and maybe going up, up, up. There will be very few people wanting to use Federal Reserve notes. And, of course, the collectivists in government know that. And that's true in all societies, all collectivist systems, which is why every one of them must have a system based on coercion. They call them legal tender laws. By legal tender laws, you are forced, under pain of punishment, to accept the state's money, no matter what it is, no matter how bad it is. You must do it, or you go to prison. And so there's another distinction. Individualists believe that we should have the freedom to choose whatever we want to for money or barter. If we want to use Federal Reserve notes, fine. If we want to use what do they call those things? The blue chip stamps. Remember, you used to say blue chip stamps. You go down and buy some chairs and things. We did that in our man. We use those blue chip stamps like money. You know, if you want to use Disneyland tickets for money, fine, go do it. It's your choice. And if you want to use gold or silver, I think that's probably what you'll wind up using over a period of time. But so there is another important distinction, and any individualist, after thinking about these choices, will gravitate instinctively to freedom of choice with money. Number 6, now we've left the realm of specifics and we come to things which are more like catch-alls. Everything up to this point are very specific to a topic, but there are certain gray areas in any political discussion where you think, well, maybe this and maybe that. There's an overlap. And so there are two categories here that are used like baskets to pick up the loose ends. And one of them is equality versus inequality under law. Now, we all go through the motions of saying we think everybody should be treated equally under the law, right? Anybody hear any politician ever say that people should be treated unequally under the law? They wouldn't ever say that. But 99.99999% of our laws treat people unequally under the law. Every one of them. I can't think of any that doesn't. Because we're all trying to accomplish some kind of a social objective. We're trying to redistribute wealth or give somebody an advantage. Somebody pays a politician under the table and says, I want a tax loophole. We've got deductions for this and exemptions for that and refunds for this. And the whole system is built upon inequality under law. And people don't realize that they're voting for that. Why? Well, sometimes they do, but that's because they think they're going to benefit from it, that they're going to get more out of it than they put into it. And let me assure you, it doesn't work that way. You never get more out of this, unless you're a crook. You know, if you're at the top, you probably get more out of it than you put into it. But the taxpayers and the inflation payers at the bottom level never get more out of it than they put into it. So the idea that collectivism is always built upon the deliberate concept of inequality. They're trying to change some natural system. They're trying to benefit some group because it has merit in most cases. They say, well, this group is poor. They need to be supported. So therefore, the ones with the money have to give it to the ones without the money. Notice I said have to. Now, if they said they should, that would be individualism. But no, they never say they should. They say they have to, and we will take it from taxes, and we will administer it, take our cut out of the middle, of course, and then give it to the poor after we get our share. And so there you have. When you look at all the laws that are proposed by collectivists, they are based on inequality application, unequal application of the law in some way. Individualists understand that the only basis for a really free and just society, and that word was used earlier today. I was really glad to hear it, that the word just was used, because there's that instinct in all of us. It's not just equal. That's fine, but how do you measure equal? You know, sometimes you get into that gray area again, but we all know what just means because we feel it in our heart. Anyway, whatever that thing justice is, only comes when there's absolute equality for every individual and every class and every group. Nobody gets any favoritism, regardless of the purity of their cause or the worthiness of their cause, because they can all make a great case for having a big cause. And finally, the last one is, what is the proper function of the state? Now, this is really the big one. This catches it all. What is the state supposed to be doing? Why do we even have a state? We call it the government. I think, by the way, that that's the wrong word for us to use. We're stuck with it. We inherited it. I believe it's one of the few mistakes made by our founding fathers is that they adopted the word government from the old world when they created our system. You know, they basically said, well, what kind of a government are we going to have? And so they used the word. My problem with that is that if I were to ask people to define what is the purpose of a government, I'd get all kinds of answers, but they would all be based on the concept that the purpose of a government is to govern. Oh, wait a minute, we got a problem there. Do we want to be governed by the state? Not many of us. No. What do we want from the state? What is the legitimate purpose of the state? Well, we want to be protected. We want the state to protect us. In other words, we want the state to do what we ourselves have a right to do. And see, the state is the legalized use of force. That's all it is. We all enter into a compact with each other. We say, okay, we're going to designate to this thing called the state the authority to use force against human beings, to use physical force, lethal force, if necessary. What do we have a right to use lethal force for? What do we have a right to do that for? Well, think about it. We have a right to use lethal force to protect our lives, our liberty, our property, and that's the end of the list. That's it. So if that's the limit of our use of lethal force, it's impossible for us to designate to our elected representatives that they can use lethal force for anything else, because we don't have the right. We can't give it to them. And so we wind up in a situation where we don't like our neighbor opening his store on Sunday because of religious reasons that we may have. I'm just using that as an example. And we can't go to our neighbor and say, I'm going to put you in a box and starve you and torture you if you open up your store on Sunday. Of course not. But we go and we vote for some politician that's going to pass a law that will do the same thing to the neighbor because supposedly we voted for him to do that. We cannot give him a right that we ourselves do not have. And so the proper function of the state boils down to a very simple formula. And whenever you're in doubt as to whether or not a piece of legislation is authorized by this concept, here it is. The proper function of the state is to defend the life, liberty, and property of its citizens and nothing more. That's it. I believe that it was the basic concept that was built into our republic. Remember, it was a beta model, and people get all uptight because, oh, they made a mistake here, or, they had slaves, or, they find flaws with it. Of course, it's a beta model, folks. Did you ever see a beta model of any complex machine that really worked perfectly the first time out? No, it doesn't happen. We have a chance now to build upon a couple of 100 years of experience of this beta model and improve it. It could use a little improvement, but the basic concept was excellent. And it was the concept of individualism, but they just never used the word. So I believe that when we talk about these things and they say, what kind of a government do you want? My answer is, I don't want a government, I want a protectorate. That's the word I would like to see people start to use to describe the state that we want. We have a chance to make it whatever we want to. We hope we'll have a chance, let's say. It's certainly not a protectorate today, is it? No, it's a tyranny. It's becoming a tyranny. But we have to know what we want as well as what we don't want, because that is the mistake of history. People fight against a tyrant, and at great cost in treasure and blood, they'll overthrow the tyrant and replace him with somebody just as bad, or maybe even worse, because they did not know what they believed or what they wanted. It was all against rather than for. And we see that in modern politics today. How many people vote for a candidate as compared to those who vote against a candidate? I don't like this guy, but I'm voting for him because I hate the other guy. This is insane. This is how we got to where we are. We must know what we believe in and stand by our guns to those beliefs and principles at all costs. And if it means voting for yourself for president, well, then fine, do it. But don't vote for somebody that you know represents the opposite of your beliefs, you see what I'm trying to say. We must restore these concepts to our thinking. We must restore the words individualism and collectivism back to our vocabulary. And I'd like to close by reading to you what we call the Creed of Freedom, which is a summary of all of these 7 concepts. And by the way, I might mention that the 2 other that I said were not too important. One, I should throw that in. One is that all collectivist systems have a great leader. You know, Adolf Hitler, Lenin, Mao Zedong, Obama, whatever you know. The great leader, right? Mussolini, a classic example, chin sticking out. He was the great leader. They strut around, and the public seems to like that. If they buy into collectivism, they like the great leader because they think that he represents the state and his power represents safety for them. So they like it. They all have that. And the other thing is that all of the collectivist states are opposed to any organization that pulls loyalty and dependence of the people away from the state. And what would those be? Well, religious groups. All collectivist systems are deadly opposed to all forms of religion. I don't care what it is. Any kind of religion, they're opposed to it because people depend on their religion for answers to important questions. They have friends in their religious groups, and they depend on each other for mutual assistance. So the collectivist state is always against religion for that reason. And what else? What other group do people depend on? The family, right? The state cannot stand the family because that's an element of support for individuals. They want people completely isolated from each other so they have no place to go except to the state. So those are 2 more I thought I'd throw in. I found that between those 9 principles, all collectivist systems of the world are exactly the same once you peel off the label. And we must understand it because we are building that system in America right now. Right now. Every one of these features is in place right now, and we have to know that is our enemy. Our enemy is not socialism, it is not communism, fascism, Nazism, it is not even the Democrats, it's not the Republicans, it's not the progressives, it's collectivism, ladies and gentlemen. Let's get clear on what our enemy is, and then we might have a chance of overcoming him. So all of this is put into what we call the Creed of Freedom, and I'll close on that now, and I hope I haven't run over too much time, Dan. So here it is. I believe that only individuals have rights, not the collective group. That these rights are intrinsic to each individual, not granted by the state. For if the state has the power to grant them, it also has the power to deny them. And that is incompatible with personal liberty. I believe that a just state derives its power solely from the citizens. Therefore, the state must never presume to do anything beyond what individual citizens also have the right to do. Otherwise, the state is a power unto itself and becomes the master instead of the servant of society. I believe that one of the greatest threats to freedom is to allow any group, no matter its numeric superiority, to deny the rights of the minority, and that one of the primary functions of a just state is to protect each individual from the greed and passion of the majority. I believe that desirable social and economic objectives are better achieved by voluntary action than by coercion of law. I believe that social tranquility and brotherhood are better achieved by tolerance, persuasion, and the power of good example than by coercion of law. I believe that those in need are better served by charity, which is the giving of one's own money, than by welfare, which is the giving of other people's money through coercion of law. I believe that the human instinct for private property is a positive force because it provides an incentive for production, which is necessary for the material support of mankind. It justly rewards those who use resources wisely and punishes those who abuse them. Those without property must depend on others for survival, and those who depend on the state must serve the state. Therefore, private property is a human right, essential for prosperity, justice, and freedom. I believe in freedom to accept or reject any currency or other forms of money based entirely upon my personal judgment of its value, because a monopoly over the issuance of money and the power to force others to accept it leads to corruption, inflation, and legalized plunder. I believe that all citizens should be equal under law, regardless of their national origin, race, religion, gender, education, economic status, lifestyle, or political opinion. Likewise, no class should be given preferential treatment, regardless of the merit or popularity of its cause. To favor one class over another is not equality under law. And finally, I believe that the proper function of the state is negative, not positive, defensive, not aggressive. It is to protect, not to provide. For if the state is granted the power to provide for some, it must also be able to take from others. And that always leads to legalized plunder and loss of freedom. If the state is powerful enough to give us everything we want, it also will be powerful enough to take from us everything we have. Therefore, the proper function of the state is to protect the lives, liberty, and property of its citizens, nothing more. That state is best, which governs least. Thank you very much. I'd like to start by saying that it's my honor and privilege to donate my honorarium tonight to your cause. That's all right. That's all right. Thank you. Thank you. So, any questions? To my left. Oh, yes. Okay. Oh, okay. The question about bail-ins. Yeah, that's a good topic. I'll try and keep it short. Those of you who may not be familiar with the phrase bail-in as opposed to bail-out, it's a rather new phrase. We all know what bail-outs are. That's where the corrupt banks get into trouble and they want to pass their losses on to the taxpayers. And so they get their buddies in Congress to pass the legislation that authorizes the fact that the government will create the money through the Federal Reserve and actually give the money back to the Federal Reserve, to the banks, and balance their books with newly created money. And that then passes the cost on to taxpayers in the form of inflation, like we were describing earlier. Well, that's been going on quite a bit, as you know, and it amounts to many billions of dollars by now. And there's quite a bit of pushback from the tax-paying public. So now, for the first time, I think it was last year, they tried something called the bail-in instead of the bailout. It occurred in Cyprus last year. And what that means is that the banks simply took the money out of the depositors' accounts. And they said, it's ours now, thank you very much. And it highlighted the accounting practice that the banks now consider, and have for quite some time, but we didn't know it, they consider that your deposits are not yours, they're really theirs. When you put money in a bank now, they consider that you've given it to them as an investment. And it's now their responsibility to do what they can do with your money as an investment. It really belongs to them, and you've given it to them for that purpose. And so if they need it to make up the losses, they have a right to do so. That's called a bail-in. Actually, it's kind of a misnomer because all they're doing is just taking money from you. They're charging you a fee or an assessment for their losses. One way or the other, they're going to get it from you. That's what banks do. As I said earlier, that banks really are some of the most corrupt institutions in the world, even though they go to great lengths to appear to be very staid and very conservative and very honest. They're among the most dishonest businesses in the world. But they do it all legally. See, that's the important thing. They never do anything, or seldom do anything illegal. They try and make it legal, and they go to Congress and they get whatever they want to do, they get it passed into law first, so it's legal to do. Now, the thing that I think that we need to know about the bail-ins is that this isn't going to fly, because the minute people realize that if they leave their money in the bank, that the bank could easily just take it from them, to make up their losses, they're going to take their money out of the banks. And that's already happening in Europe now. It's already happened in Greece. And it's already beginning to happen here in the United States as people talk about this very thing. Because those who are in the know recognize that the same thing is probably going to happen here in the United States. So those who can see the handwriting on the wall are taking most of their money out of the banks and finding some other place to put them just for their own self-defense. The banks are feeling the drain, and so that's the reason the big move is on now to get rid of currency. You saw it first, I think it was in Sweden or one of the Scandinavian countries, already has declared currency to be illegal. They're no longer currency of any kind in that country. And in other countries in the European Union, they are withdrawing their highest EU bills, I think it's 500. And already here in the United States, the Federal Reserve and the banks are talking about removing $100 bills from circulation. And this is merely the first step in a long discussed plan to remove currency entirely and to go to what they call the cashless society. And there are two reasons for that. One is so that you will not be able to withdraw your money from the banks because there will be no money to withdraw from. If you don't have any currency, how are you going to take your money out of the banks, you see? It's all digital. So you have to leave it in the banks, and therefore you're sitting ducks when they start to do the bail-ins. It's the only way that a bail-in can work is if you don't have an option to take your money out. And the other reason for the bail-in and the cashless society is because if there's no such thing as a cash transaction, every little transaction for a package of gum has to go through the banking system, through the digital system, through the credit card of some kind, and the banks will get their little piece of the action on every single cash transaction in the world, which is the end game as far as they're concerned. So that's what's going on, and that's my answer to your question about the bail-in. You can't just look at the bail-in by itself. It's part of this larger picture of the banks virtually taking over all of your personal financial transactions and taking them out of your personal control. The other side of that coin is that I've only talked about the money that you put into the banks. Don't forget, you take money out of the banks too. Most of us, or most people, have their paychecks now run through the banks, and they get paid through checks that go through the banks. So if the banks control the flow of money in all directions, they and their partners in government could stop your income, just like that. All they need is some bureaucrat to say, well, we have reason to suspect this person of money laundering or structuring their deposits or being a domestic terrorist or something like that. And they could impound all of your income as well. This is the holy grail of the collectivists. They want everybody completely dependent on the government and the banks for their economic existence. That's what's behind the bail-in and what's behind the cashless society, in my view. Does that answer your question? About the dollar what? Oh, the dollar and the world reserve currency, well, it's on its way out. That's all I can say. I don't know how long it's going to be before the dollar will no longer be the world reserve currency, but I don't think it's going to be very long. I can't answer how long that is because I'm always bad at making predictions. I always think it's going to happen sooner than it does, but I do know it's going to happen, and my guess is that it's probably going to happen in the next few years. Other countries are trying to generate currencies that will become competition to the U.S. dollar. The IMF is planning for, the drawing rights, the international monetary fund money, international money. Then, too, we understand that there's something called the Amero. Did people know about the Amero? Have you heard of that? Well, for a long time, they've been planning to create a regional currency between the United States, Mexico, and Canada to serve the same function that the euro serves in Europe, a regional currency, to replace national currencies. And they have already given it a name. It's called the Amero. They deny that this is underway, but it's not difficult to find their documents and the minutes of their meetings and the funding and all kinds of plans underway. They just don't want to talk about it. The big question in my mind is which is going to come first. Until recently, I always thought that they were going to follow the pattern of going to a regional currency first as a transition to the true international currency. which probably will be called the Bancor. That's been the name they've used for it for many years. That doesn't mean they're going to stick with it, but still they're using the word Bancor for the international currency, and the word Amaro for the regional currency. I thought that was the plan. That's what they seem to indicate. But now the conversations seem to be that they're in a hurry, that things are running faster than they anticipated, and the whole thing could go belly up real fast. And I think they want to go to an international currency as fast as possible. So I'm just saying that we might not be surprised, we shouldn't be surprised if they decide to run for the Bancor directly. Either way, the American dollar will become merely part of a basket of currencies. And so it's going to disappear as the international trading currency of the planet. And when, I don't know. But we know this is coming, so what do we do about it? Any sensible person would get whatever savings or whatever wealth they have off the railroad tracks. If you can see the train is coming down the tracks, you don't want to stand there staring at it. The railroad tracks is money in a bank. We need money in the bank to pay our bills and utility bills and grocery bills and day-to-day expenses. But if you've got your entire savings in banks or in American dollars, even insurance policies, that kind of thing that pay off in American dollars, you're standing on the tracks, ladies and gentlemen, and the train is coming. What you do about it, of course, is up to you, but what I would do is get off the tracks. Does that sound pretty severe? Okay. Any questions? Any more?
Right here.
Yes, sir?
Hello. You've identified the feds as a cartel. I'd like if you would define the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. Would you give that a definition as a cartel? And are we headed to a one world economic system, whether it be digital or physical?
The last question is easier to answer for me. I'm not clear in my mind how the International Monetary Fund would serve as a cartel, but I know that it must, because that's the only game they know. That's the only trick they know. I just don't know what the mechanism would be and which banks would represent it. I suspect that the way it will work is that the existing central banks, which themselves are cartels, would form into a closer partnership through the Bank of International Settlements, which is located in Switzerland. I think that, well, we know that's already a highly functional regulatory body, but itself is not a cartel. It's like a labor union of the cartels. It's a control panel or a control central for the separate cartels. I think it'll probably continue to be that way. I see no reason for it to change, but it'll appear to the world, exactly as you said, as a global centralized economic system. That's what they want. That's what they want, because only under such conditions is there no escape. As long as you have different currencies, there's some maneuverability. You can go from one currency to the other, which sometimes shows up in a humorous way, because if you turn on the news, the newscaster will say, well, the dollar was stronger today. It went up 24 points or whatever the number is, and it's stronger today. Oh, isn't this a good day for the dollar? What they don't say is that the dollar went down, but the other currencies went down more. That's what made the dollar stronger, because they never talk about an absolute standard like gold or purchasing power. It's always a relative standard to the other currencies. It's a trick they play. So none of the currencies are getting stronger at any time. They're all getting weaker and weaker and weaker. But it's a free fall for the bottom among them all. And as long as that exists, you can still jump from one currency to the other and enjoy a little reprieve on the way down. But once there's only one currency and no option to escape, well, then you're stuck. And that's all there is to it. That's what they want. They want you totally without options. We have to stop that, and we can. I'd like to say something. I had a couple of people ask me, well, what can we do about it, and do you have a plan for this? I really didn't get into that, but you saw the name up on the screen earlier, Freedom Force International. We do have a plan of how to turn this around. I think it's a realistic plan. And so anybody that is interested in a solution to this problem, please take note of freedomforceinternational.org. Go check it out. I think you're going to find It's a very reasonable and practical plan. It may take a generation or two, but it will work, in my view.
Mr. Griffin,
Yes, sir.
could you explain the effects of negative interest rates like we're seeing in Asia, in the Asian markets, in conjunction with her question about bail-ins and its relevance to the bail-ins?
Yeah, it's a similar trick to the negative interest rates. I mean, to the bail-in. Negative interest rates are merely a name for a procedure whereby the bank removes money from your deposit and takes it, and they take it for whatever is legal, whatever they pay the politicians to write a law to make legal. They'll take it for that purpose. It may not be to bail out the banks, in which case we'd call it a bail-in, but it will be somehow to benefit the banks. That's the only reason for it. So when you hear the word negative interest rate, just remember it's another way by which the banks are looking for a legal method of extracting money from your bank account, which they consider to be theirs. It's as simple as that. Yes, ma'am? Yeah. The question is, can the world really operate today realistically under money that is coinage based on precious metals? Excuse me. I believe it certainly can. It did for hundreds of years. It's just a question of denomination of the coins. And now we can digitize it. If you can find an institution that you can trust, which is hard to do, and if you put your money into an institution and they say, well, we'll credit you for your gold and you can take it as a credit, you better trust that organization. Excuse me, I'm sorry for the cough. I arrived with a California cold. I'm just grateful I didn't have to do this during my talk. But aside from the digitizing of it, thank you. Aside from digitizing it, that's the reason they use silver. They use silver as a circulatory money. Gold traditionally has been used for larger denomination projects and investments, whereas silver has traditionally been used for daily purchases like a loaf of bread or a bottle of water or something like that. So it's quite practical. It has worked for hundreds and hundreds of years, actually thousands of years, and it could work again today, I believe. And certainly work a lot better than the fiat system we have now. Yes. Well, I guess that's it. No point in dragging this. Okay, yes, sir? I believe it is. The question is, does America still have the resilience, the productive capacity, and the natural resources to grow and prosper as an independent nation? I believe we do, only with one condition, and that is that we get the collectivist system off our back. As long as we allow that to remain, the answer is no, because that will absolutely poison any effort to become independent. It'll always put the state in control of everything, and once that happens, there are political motives, those who run the state, and they will prevent it from happening because they'll siphon everything off and stick it in their own pockets. So the answer is yes, and if we follow the plan that's advanced at Freedom Force International, it's definitely yes, and I think it can be done probably in a generation or two. But that means a lot of work in the meantime. Well, ladies and gentlemen, no point in dragging this on. I'll be available afterwards if you want to talk to me. I'd be delighted to speak with you. Thank you very much for cutting out to hear what I have to say.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to close this. Please, there are books to be, autographs to be had, books to be bought. We're closing out the silent auction items. Thank you so very much for your support on this. And Anna is going to close this event with a beautiful song. Thank you.
Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He is trampling out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. He has loosed the fateful lightning of his terrible swift sword. His truth is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. His truth is marching on. He is sounding forth the trumpet that shall never call retreat. He is sifting out the hearts of men before his judgment seat. Oh,